Imagine, if you will, the act of sailing a ship in the 17th or 18th century, not just on a journey across the English Channel to mainland Europe, but something more substantial. Sailing across oceans, traversing distances of several thousand miles. Picture doing so in a ship of around 200 tons, laden with a cargo of humans to be sold to the New World. As a crewman on such a ship, you were the steward of a valuable cargo, the custodian of trafficked human capital, both valuable yet threatening. Slaves. But the interests of those who concern themselves with the commerce of and surrounding the slave trade spread across the ocean and extended to the city itself, the square mile. For a second, imagine that you are one of those financing such an undertaking, seeking the rewards that come from the triangular trade, profits to be made in the buying and selling of Negroes, and the further profits to be had from the transportation of sugar, mahogany, spices, indigo, and other commodities. You may be a former ship's captain who has forged alliances with wealthier men to organize this familiar endeavor. You may be a merchant involved in the marine industry with sufficient capital to make the necessary arrangements to provide a ship. But in this risky business, the process of organizing, provisioning, and profiting from a vessel was not a sure thing. Beyond the perils of the sea, such as shipwreck and natural death in all its forms, there were human risks, such as mutiny and the suicides of the enslaved. You see, the trafficked cargo too were active, often seeking to resist by laying down their very lives, rather than facing the horror of the Middle Passage, in overcrowded holds on low rations, separated from family and friends, from their very humanity. These commercial risks were, however, inherent in the business practiced by the men who financed and carried out the mass trafficking of Black Africans in the 17th and 18th centuries. And these risks were codified, calculated, and mitigated by an insurance industry which blossomed in the square mile. The burgeoning sector of insurance profited greatly from its involvement in the slave trade. In this and the next episode of Black in the City of London, I'm looking at the insurance industry, its role in perpetuating the slave trade, and the profits derived from this history. And in the next episode, I will look at how Lloyds and others in this industry have begun to make amends for the past. My reasons for doing so are as follows. The insurance industry in the square mile was clearly intertwined in the transatlantic slave trade. Some of the companies involved in the trade are still extant today, and to their credit, some have made attempts to reckon with the past. Others have not. We should examine these efforts in our next episode.
Sir, could you direct me the way to Lloyd's Coffee House?
It is honorable to ensure Dance's legs is the cargo of the sloop. The day will come, I warrant, when it will be known from Liverpool to Bombay that Lloyds of London insures everything under the sun.
Can we insure a cargo of slaves, sir?
Slaves? Certainly not.
Yes.
Black in the City of London.
So I'm here with Dr. Alexandra White and Pierre Seth from Black Beyond Data, which was the organization that was tasked with doing the research into Lloyd's historical legacy and entanglement in the slave trade. Could you introduce yourselves, please?
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for having us. My name's Alexander White, or I also go by Sasha White. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and the history of medicine at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm also a primary investigator on Black Beyond Data and one of the lead researchers on underwriting souls.
Hey, Jonathan. It's a real pleasure to be here and be in conversation with you today. My name is Pierre Seth, and I'm a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University pursuing a dual degree in anthropology and political science. I'm also co-developed the Underwriting Souls project with Sasha.
What are the main findings someone will encounter when interacting with the Underwriting Souls digital exhibition?
So Underwriting Souls is really a digital archive or digitized archive of all the materials in the Lloyd's collection pertaining to its role in Atlantic slavery and the transatlantic slave trade in particular, as well as a series of 9 distinct exhibitions that attempt to contextualize that history and kind of exist as a online museum. What we unearthed and what we found confirmed a lot of things that many historians and researchers had long thought might have been possible, which is that the Lloyd's market in the 18th and early 19th century played a very significant role, a key role in ensuring slaving voyages traveling across the Atlantic, trafficking Africans. Also, many of the key members of the Lloyd's market, the senior governing committee, was made up of slave traders, people who had significant experiences and engagements enslaving people or active within the slave trade as slaving ship owners. Some were formerly ship captains on slaving voyages, others on plantations, either remotely or directly in the West Indies. And others, in fact, were also governors of slaving forts on the coast of West Africa. So what we found ostensibly are records of a Lloyd's market that was densely connected to the insurance of slavery, but also members of Lloyd's, key subscribers of Lloyd's, that were also deeply, deeply connected to slavery in their own personal business and interests in ways that we didn't realize before.
I mean, I've talked to Jean-François Manicon, who's the curator of the Museum of London at Docklands, and he said a very interesting thing to me, that the history of slavery it's like curating a history without many artifacts, without many physical things. What are the artifacts and the things you found in that archive that were able to bring this to life?
What you'll hear from historians of slavery, quite often is that, when you're doing this kind of work, you oftentimes see in the archive, you oftentimes hear that Black folk were, reduced to that of a number. But I think in our particular kind of work, I think what we actually found was that, Black folk were very much oftentimes reduced to a destination. One of the key artifacts or the exhibits, and, for the research that we were doing, they were 2 wrist books, one from Horatio Clagett and from likely, still working to, do some confirmation on this end, but likely kind of Solomon Daglar. And so, in these wrist books, you'll see enslaving voyages that are leaving ports in London, ports in Liverpool, and then headed off to a whole host of different destinations, parts of the Caribbean, the Americas. And so I think one of the questions that I think historians of slavery more broadly, but I think for us doing this research, I think one of the challenges or one of the questions we had was essentially kind of, where do you start, right? How do we commence thinking? Slavery has and always will be a global story, and Lloyd's is a specific institution, and they develop a specific set of practices. But this is a story, and I think you very much see this in our work as well, is that this is a story that takes you all across the globe, and so there are always endless limitations on what we can know, and I think that's the case with all archives. But none of that actually takes away from the fact that slavery and the transatlantic slave trade was huge, right? It was foundational, right, to the making of the modern world. And as we know, one of the most horrific events in human history. So I think it's some of those tensions, right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that slavery was horrific in every sense of the word, but I think there are another kind of sets of questions about what do you hope to gain from this research? And I think this is ultimately where the digital humanities kind of fits in as well, allowing the public to ask some of those questions themselves as well. And being able to engage with some of these stories.
I guess I may be asking a question that you're leading on to. What are the challenges that you encountered in humanizing the experiences and when researching and responding to the archive material, and what ethical problems did those challenges throw up?
Yeah, I think that's actually the crux of the question behind guiding the work, and something that we, attempted to take very, very seriously. As BR, discussed, I think that all archives are incomplete in that they don't tell a full story. These archives in particular, at Lloyd's, we're very much representing the perspectives and concerns and interests of those who are actively trying to profit from the trafficking of human beings. You have to take that perspective that's embedded within these materials very, very seriously and attempt to resist it. A lot of what we did was actually explore further archives across Britain and digital archives elsewhere to put pieces together to understand the context of some of these materials. But the other aspect that we really wanted to take as a critical part of the methodology was the ethics behind this work. So for this project, we developed an external advisory board that oversaw the project, made up of academics, historians, public historians, and activists, as well as members of the arts world. And it was a multiracial Black British group of advisors to oversee the ethics of the work and to oversee all aspects of the project. In addition, our other materials on underwritingsouls.org had been peer reviewed. So we wanted to maintain very high standards of academic rigor. And in addition, through an independent collaboration with Lloyds, we wanted to make sure that there was both financial and editorial separation between us as researchers and academics and Lloyd itself. And the ethics of the project kind of attempted to run up and down through, from the structuring of the project to the methodology that we engaged in. In terms of humanizing the experiences of enslaved people, what we tried to do in numerous points, especially in the exhibitions, was to challenge and confront the explicit perspectives that were being presented from those who were actively engaged in trafficking or ensuring the lives of enslaved people. And to do this, I think there are several examples, especially in the exhibit relating to the Gipuzkoa slaving ship agreement. We tried, as best we could in many ways, is to think about the peoples who were on board these ships, their experiences, and to critically consider them and their experiences before we focused explicitly on the men who were seeking to profit from their bodies and their labor. In addition, when we looked at some of the key members of Lloyd's, namely Joseph Marriott, who becomes a chairman of Lloyd's in 1811, we begin our focus on him by looking at the history which we know, and Catherine Hall's done brilliant work on this, on his daughter, Anne Marriott, who was born enslaved to her biological father, and her mother, who was someone enslaved by him. And we focus on repositioning that narrative and repositioning his narrative to actually focus on her from the outset, to consider how this actually really shifts our understanding of Marriott himself. I think there are numerous points in the discussions of the archive, or in the materials explaining the objects in the archive, that Victoria Lane, the archivist who worked with us at Lloyd's, was absolutely essential in developing with us. There's language and ways we can talk about these materials that breathe humanity back into documents that are attempting to, at every stage, dehumanize other people. And this is where we tried to act in every possible place to not restore, but recover the humanity that was seeking to be disrupted and destroyed by the actual practices that these documents made possible.
Two things that I think we were really trying to, think about, over the course of this project, and those two things being narrative and form. And so I think, also within the exhibits, I think we also tried to narrativize, these documents in particular kinds of ways to try to, quote unquote, set the scene, right, in a particular way that isn't just an insurer, right, or an underwriter signing an agreement and then that's that, right? Really trying to attend to the logics, right? These different kind of violent financial logics that, very much made the architecture of the slave trade, right, and made the slave trade possible on a number of fronts. And so I think what you'll see, in discussions of the Gipuzkoa and the risk books and the like, are descriptions that are try to set the scene and trying to narrate exactly what's happening here, what exactly is taking place. And I think the language piece as well, becomes a really big part of that as well. How do we actually even attend to, some of these stories? And again, kind of as I mentioned a little bit earlier, where do we begin? And so I think sometimes that does start with the setting the scene in particular ways.
Definitely. It's a task that requires great trust that's been placed in you guys. And it's trust that's been placed in you guys, not only by those who may have interests that stretch through their cultural heritage, but trust that was placed in you by Lloyds. And it was very interesting to hear that you were given freedom, that you mentioned. Freedom both financially, because your project was funded, I believe, by the Mellon Foundation, but also freedom editorially. So how important was it to you that Lloyds gave you this freedom to explore and respond and to report on their legacy without interference? And how was that freedom guaranteed, if you could sort of state that explicitly?
Really quickly, since you mentioned trust, and I think this is a really important aspect, we also built on existing knowledge and structures that many have already developed. We're deeply indebted to the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project that started at UCL that really paved the way in looking at the slavery compensation practices from the Bank of England, paved the way for these sorts of projects to be developed. And in addition, I think about a lot of public historians that have been doing incredible work on recovering Black British history that's always been there, but it actively been suppressed, like the work of Black History Walks and other entities that have been really, really central. And we collaborated with it at numerous points that have done a lot more, I think, than we've been able to do given the materials to speak about the Black experience in Britain, at these times, and also forms of resistance and practices against slavery and abolition in particular. I commend Lloyds for engaging in such an open and transparent collaboration. So we approached Lloyds in the summer of 2021 about the possibility of a collaboration to digitize their archives pertaining to the transatlantic slave trade, and then also a digital humanities platform around the project. And this would become Underwriting Souls. In March of 2022, we finalized a collaboration between Johns Hopkins and Lloyds that stipulated that the Mellon Foundation and Johns Hopkins would fund this research, and that no funding would be provided to the researchers, myself, PR, and others from Lloyds itself. And we wanted to maintain this explicitly because we wanted to make sure that there was no risk of bias in the work that we did. So Lloyds had no say in any of the language produced on the site of Underwriting Souls. With funding support from the Mellon Foundation, we also stipulated that there would be an advisory board that would be supported with funds from the provided by Mellon for Black Beyond Data, as well as support for the production of a poetry and artistic volume to respond to the archives and the materials themselves, which became the volume Uprising and Resistance, produced by Ink, Sweat, and Tears and Spread the Word, as well as peer review of all the content produced. So Lloyds, I think provided, or hopefully this project provides somewhat of a model for a particular form of transparent and ethical collaboration between a corporate entity and the university in ways that ensures ethical and independent research while engaging deeply with complex and painful archives.
So what motivated you to approach the collaboration in this respect? Was it a model that you'd seen successfully applied in other circumstances? Or was it something that and in addition, it would be something that you'd like to replicate in future in other, do you see other scope for it, is what I'm asking, other relevant places for this kind of model in the work that you would seek to attempt to do in the future?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question, right? Because I think that this is, I think what we wanted to put together was a model that is replicable in particular ways. And I do think that it is an example of ethical research that produces something for public good and tries as best they can to limit harms to descendant communities who might be affected by the materials, and also worked with, those with descendants of enslaved people and the Black British and Black American communities to develop it. I think that the model is, and I think this speaks to a little bit, some of the challenges of funding for UK-based projects. Despite the fact that I grew up in the UK and I am British, I speak with an American accent. I'm from an American institution, and we were able to do this work in no small part because of the funding from a large American philanthropy that would support this work. And we're very grateful to the Mellon Foundation for everything they did to support this. But I think part of the challenge is the resources necessary to produce this are not necessarily there in the UK at the scale that they might be available for US institutions to do this sort of work comparatively. And I think that as a result, that poses a real challenge. And I suggest that a lot of this work should be being done by British academic institutions in particular. And for that, there needs to be significantly more funding. While Lloyds played a large role in both the maintenance of and the perpetuation of the Atlantic slave trade, they weren't alone. And there are other histories that remain to be uncovered and recovered.
And I think another thing that actually makes this quite tricky, as Sasha mentioned, 2020, George Floyd really shook the world in more ways than one, right? I think we all know that. And so, it takes, a high profile, quote unquote, high profile kind of murder along with a global pandemic, right? And so you have all these different kind of political moments, these, political events, kind of unfolding. And then you see this kind of domino effect of institutions saying that they're going to wrestle or reckon with their racist past, right? And so, I think that's another kind of piece of things that I think also kind of makes it tricky. You have all these different things unfolding at the particular moment. And then, having funding, as Sasha mentioned, right, from the Mellon Foundation to be able to come in and do this kind of project. So, to some extent, right, all of these kind of different pieces, all these different moments, right, actually work together in a particular way that allow this collaboration to unfold in the ways that it did, right? So, I think this work is important, and I think we'd love to see more folk, undertake this work, in particular, because as Sasha mentioned, Lloyds was not alone. And so I think there's so much more work that needs to be done. But I also, thinking about, how these kinds of collaborations, how these different kind of research partnerships, unfold, moving forward, I think there are a lot of questions that I think folk are kind of thinking about. What happens when corporate entities open their archives, and how does the City of London, how do, different kind of institutions more broadly, decidedly, wrestle with their history?
There seem to be these different approaches. Like Lloyd seemed to be quite on the front foot from 2020, when all of the emotional outpouring, all of the political resistance happened in 2020. Lloyd seemed to be on the front foot, putting forward some sort of acceptance, some sort of attempt at responsibility. There are kind of lots of other institutions that are between sitting on their hands and denying the need to reckon with their past. Lloyd's has sort of an unbroken history from that time to now. So, like, there are people in the building that have familial skin in the game, I'm sure. What resistance and challenges did you face in the course of putting together your project?
We didn't face resistance from Lloyd's at all, actually. Lloyd's was a really, Lloyd's collaborated well, with us really throughout the process. I think what Lloyd's provided, both in terms of, in terms of the collaboration, is a model for how to engage in these sorts of collaborations. I think you mentioned a lot of other institutions that have either been on the front foot or have resisted these calls. And I think that, what we've seen really since, as PR mentioned, since 2020, has been a particular form of recognition of a lot of work that had come before. I think about Nick Draper and Catherine Hall, Katie Donington, and others who were doing this work long before this kind of moment of reckoning started in 2020, where you had institutions suddenly apologizing for their historic role in the slave trade. So, and I think that Lloyd's is one example of response. Bank of England and the Church of England Commission are two others. So, in terms of the research and access and respect for the separation between Lloyd's and our work, Lloyd's was very, very supportive.
Of course, slavery in like modern day discourse is a politicized concept, and it's bandied about in cultural discourse and political discourse in the media. Obviously, this was a high profile. The launch event was a high profile event because it included some attempt at making reparations for the past. I'll put it in those terms. Has any of that blowback hit you guys? Have you sort of received any commentary on your socials or personal channels that have come back about your involvement?
No. And I think, that's, but I recognize that this is very, the stakes of this sort of work for many people is very high. And I think that, we only need to look at some of the both media, formal media and social media harassment that we've seen occur over the last few years and earlier around historians, researchers, activists who would speak out about the really central role that slavery played in the making of modern Britain and the modern world, and the ways in which they faced death threats, faced harassment, faced job insecurity in all sorts of ways. And I think it's important to recognize the real sacrifices that many people have made to do this work and to speak the truth on these issues. I'm very grateful that we haven't experienced that. But I think it's really critical that we recognize the sacrifices that many people have made to do this work.
And I think some of the conversations that have taken place, especially, since the launch event, some of them to a significant extent were, expected. We kind of expected folk to have conversations about reparations, right? And the money that would be put forth, right, to respond to Lloyd's history. And so I think, much of that was also anticipated and expected, right? And for there to be a lot of questions and, comments, and again, just further debate and kind of conversations about, reparations. I think, that's something that I think so many of us are kind of trying to attend to. It's a big question, right? And so, I think some of it also hasn't been entirely surprising. And I'd also say it's necessary, right, to have these conversations as well, So I think that's another piece of things too.
Did you guys know you'd be launching, sort of making your announcement at the same time that Lloyds would be making an announcement of a package of other measures, financial measures? Was that something that was all sort of coordinated? Coordinated is not a pejorative word. It's not meant to be pejorative. Coordinated.
No, we were aware that the response that the Lloyd's response would be coming out at the same time, and I think it was actually important that it was that way, because fundamentally we hope that the research will play a significant role in shaping and shifting public discourse, right? But we also recognize that it's important for people to have their opinions and perspectives and their critiques of any particular responses. But I think it was important that Lloyd's responded at the time that the materials were made public as well, to demonstrate the importance of the research, but also the importance of this history.
I'd ask you guys, what are your plans and opportunities either for building on this research, or sort of what have you guys got next on the slate?
Well, PR and I are working on more academic facing books and research relating to not just Lloyd's, but relating to kind of really the financialization of the practices of enslavement. In addition, we're thinking about and potentially pursuing other opportunities to help bring previously undocumented or hidden archives to the public where we can, especially relating to these histories, and we'll see. I think right now, also we're just we're caretakers and stewards of underwriting souls. So we're still working and building that and seeing the responses to it. In addition, I think something that Lloyd's is committed to is also seeing underwriting souls be used in aspects of teaching across the UK, and we're working with schools to develop ways in which these materials could be translated to a variety of different academic settings. So making underwriting souls a public education tool is another thing that we're deeply committed to and want to see happen and be supportive of in however ways we can.
I was going to also say, just generally more archives and more research. I think some of the questions that unfolded from the Underwriting Souls project, Sasha and I visited a number of different archives across, Britain and, Liverpool. We didn't get a chance to go out to Bristol as much as we'd like. And so, potentially heading out to Bristol as well as, parts of the West Indies as well. More archives, more research. I think there are, a whole host of questions, still, yet to be asked and answered. And so I think the research, these materials it's a good place to start. But yeah, I think, we're planning to try to, revisit a lot of these archives as well. Because a lot of times, it takes, 2, 3, 4 visits, before you really start to get not a complete picture, right? But a clearer picture, right? Or even you're able to, start to piece things together, in particular ways. So yeah, more archives, more research.
And the booklet of poetry, that in itself is a powerful tool that I'm sure will be used by many, even informally, as an educative tool, as well as one that's evocative of many of the sort of gaps left by the limitations of an archival research project. Why did you choose to do that? And how important was it to include an artistic response?
Sasha's heard me, say this time and time again, but, I think in particular when we were doing this research, one of my favorite quotes and something that I had, just been thinking about, over the course of the project is from Toni Morrison. And she says there are certain traumas visited onto people so deep, so cruel that only the writer can translate such sorrow into meaning and sharpen the moral imagination. And so if you think about Morrison and you think about a text like Beloved, Beloved, I think it does so much, right, in that text. Every time I revisit it, there are even more ideas. And I'm saying to myself, my goodness, right? I hadn't thought about this, right? Morrison is just able to push you in so many different ways. And so I think, when you think about what Beloved as a text, is able to do, and I think also, if you think about writers like Morrison, and other Black feminist writers and Black feminist thinkers, I think, drawing from the Black feminist tradition, I think was a big part of this project as well. And so when you think about, the role that storytelling has played in, kind of Black studies work, and, in the history of Black feminist scholarship in particular, I think, what you'll see, thinkers like Morrison, from scholars like Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, Stephanie Smallwood, Marissa Fuentes, and the like, you see this, particular kind of history of, attending to storytelling in particular ways. I think it also kind of gets back to, something I mentioned a little bit earlier around, narrative and form. And also, I'd also say, the book of poetry, very much also functions as an archive in and of itself, right? So if you're able to, give the poetry volume a look, right? You'll see a whole host of ideas and concepts that, these poets and artists are attending to as well, these brilliant poets, presenting an additional archive and very much also a counter archive, right? A counter narrative, right? To, the materials that very much make up the Lloyds archive and the Unwriting Souls project, I think was also something that we were trying to think about as well.
All right. So Alexander White, Piacer, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Black in the City of London.
Hi, and welcome to Black in the City of London. My name is Jonathan Goddard, and I'm an educator and creative type. I live in London and love finding out about its nooks, crannies, skeletons, and inspiring tales. I suppose I agree with Dr. Johnson when he says if you're tired of London, you're tired of life. If you're like me, then the City of London, the Square Mile, holds even more of that mystique, because it seems to control so much of our lives and has been at the center of so much of our history. If you're interested in the Black experience in the past, present, and future, then this might be the pod for you. Come sate your curiosity about the history of Black people in and around the Square Mile and share the experiences of trailblazers in finance, law, and legacy institutions who speak about their experiences in the present, the recent past, and their hopes for the future.
Black in the City of London.